Folks, we only have this one planet that can support human life, so it makes sense that sustainability is fast becoming a key imperative for businesses, investors, and governments as well. So whether it's investing in ESG investment products or embedding sustainability principles in our investment portfolios, investors and operators today are expected to take a leadership role towards saving our planet. But ESG is a complex topic, and the real estate industry faces multiple challenges to move the sustainability needle in a meaningful way. CLI's Chief Sustainability Officer, Vinamra Srivastava, will give his views on how the real estate sector should approach these sustainability challenges in a holistic manner and share how CLI is translating its ambitious ESG goals into pragmatic levers and initiatives on the ground. Vince, over to you.
Thank you, Edward. Thank you very much. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I am the guy who has been put in the docks since morning multiple times. And I also noticed that since morning, the number of people on stage in the panels has been reducing. So you will have to bear just with me over the next 30 to 40 minutes. But before I start, I wanted to give you some idea about why we named this session this. And the reason was that when I was thinking about what key messages should we convey in this session, the first thought that came to my mind was there's probably not much that I can tell you about ESG or sustainability that you already cannot find out today from Google or from the multiple mainstream media that we need. So therefore, what we thought could add more value to you was to take you down the road of how an organization as complex as CLI, in terms of its width and depth of the businesses that we do, approaches this complex topic on a day-to-day basis and makes it practical in terms of the little steps that we do every day that together add up in achieving the lofty targets that we have set for ourselves. And that's why we thought that let's take you through this journey of what we call how we climb the sustainability maturity curve and give you a sneak peek of what it means back of the house. But before I do that, I do want to get all of you to do a little game with me. Can I have all the phones, please? And we want to start with a quick pulse check. If I can have all your phones, because we're going to have a QR code. What I want to know from you is, what word comes to your mind, or words come to your mind, that best reflect your ESG expectations, either for your own organization or for the companies that you invest in? One word, max, maybe, okay, 2 words, I'll give you that. Can we have the next 15 to 20 seconds for you to please key in your expectations as succinctly as possible? What words come to your mind that reflect your ESG expectations from your investee company? And the first I see is painful. Okay. Okay, we are building the word cloud here. Can we have more, please? Okay, I'm seeing some optimism, necessary, great. Oh, and then I see expensive, overdoing, okay. It is a good balance of plus and some of the challenges. Progressive, strategic, excellent. Ambiguous, I like that because I'll try to demystify that for you in this session. So it seems that the ones that are coming very clearly are decarbonizations, necessary, and yet expensing and avoiding the risk of greenwashing. And that's fantastic because I think this gives me the confidence that I'll make the next 30 minutes worth your time. Sustainability is fast becoming a key imperative. More than 70 countries have already announced their net zero pledges. More than 1,200 corporates have laid out science-based targets towards their net zero journeys. If you look at from the investment side, over the last 2 years, the amount of ESG investments by sovereign wealth funds has increased 4 times. And more than $200 billion has been poured into climate tech solutions since 2013. Even from the financiers side, $1.6 trillion was the amount of sustainable debt of all kinds raised only in 2021 globally. And that number is 11 times more than the same number in 2016. And that's to set the stage of why we are taking this so seriously today. But companies globally and across sectors are at various stages of what we call a sustainability maturity curve. And I'm quite sure that quite a lot of you are now wondering and piecing together your own company on this curve or some of the companies that you invest in. Most of the times, companies start their journey at the extreme left because they need to be compliance driven. There's mandatory reporting, and they have to meet regulatory requirements, and they have no options. As they go along in this journey, the thought process shifts towards risk mitigation. How do I use sustainability to minimize my reputation risk, to minimize my documentation risk, and protect my brand? But as companies start to get more experience, they realize that, hey, actually, this is an opportunity for me to improve my operations. And this is an important tool to actually get operational excellence. And that is when sustainability becomes a key driver to improve your operations. And you start focusing on cost savings. And then as you move on, you start realizing that, okay, everybody has actually started doing the same. How do I integrate sustainability and ESG into my business model in a way that it becomes my competitive advantage? And that means I'm able to source capital, source customers in a better way than my competitor can do. And that's where your brand starts becoming differentiated when it comes to ESG. And right at the end of the curve, and I dare say I don't think there's any company globally out there that is at that stage, and that's not a bad thing, where sustainability is the purpose for your existence. And everything that you do is because of sustainability. Now, obviously, like with all S-curves, this is not a sequential journey. And if you ask me honestly, where does CLI stand on this curve, my personal view is that we are probably inching towards using this as a competitive advantage. Does it mean that we have mastered the operational excellence stage? No, I don't think so. But we have spent a lot of effort and time to get a strong holding on that phase. And now we are working to see how does this become a niche differentiation for us as our business tags along. And why is it important to us? You would have heard this number very often. Real estate contributes to 37%. Some sources say 39, give and take, doesn't matter. But real estate contributes to almost 37% of global carbon dioxide emissions when it comes to end user industries. What makes this problem even more complex are the two charts on the right. In the next 40 years, this world is going to add GFA worth entire New York City every month. That's the amount of real estate that's going to get developed in the world based on today's projections. What makes it even worse from an ESG point of view is the chart at the bottom. And while we could only pull out APAC data, but it is representatives. And if you see the gateway cities and the profile of buildings in these cities, it may be tough to read that, but the dark blue is essentially buildings that are old before 2005. So they're at least 15 years old. The light blue are the relatively newer buildings. And these are all the gateway office or real estate cities in APAC. And this tells you that if you actually just strip out China, where you have relatively newer buildings, almost 65% of today's stock is more than 15 years old. And why is that a challenge? Because the older the stock is, obviously the least energy efficient those buildings will be because technologies weren't as sophisticated at that time. And it's reflective of the amount of investments you need to put in to decarbonize this. And that, for many players in the industry, is a huge challenge. And the challenge is because how do they balance environmental and economic goals? A lot of these investments are going to be chunky, and they may be heavy. Beyond that, we just had a session talking about frameworks and standards. It is an alphabet soup today, and I'm hoping that once ISS becomes SIN, it'll be easier for companies to be able to have a sort of a barometer and a compass of what are the right frameworks to align to. And it's easier for investors like yourself to be able to compare companies in your portfolios on a like-to-like basis. But today, that is a big challenge. Tackling indirect emissions is another huge challenge in our industry. In real estate, the indirect emissions, which is scope 3, essentially come from the carbon footprint of our tenants. That can be almost up to 50% in the entire portfolio, and things like embodied carbon, as well as buildings that are operated by third party. And that is a big issue right now where many companies haven't even started doing anything. Climate tech solutions, while have attracted a lot of investments, the maturity has been a bit uneven, and I'll spend a bit more time later about that. Greenwashing was one of the big words in the word cloud, and that is a real risk. And the only thing I want to point out in greenwashing is often we relate greenwashing to insincerity. We must understand that greenwashing is always not because of insincerity. It's often also because companies just don't know what are the right facts and figures and messages to convey. It's not that they want to do it, but the topic is so complex and the measurement is so complex that they often struggle with it, and that comes out as greenwashing. And the last, but I think the most important, the focus on people, which was a hot topic in the first session in the morning as well. Talent in sustainability is extremely scarce and limited, and I can already see a lot of heads nodding. So I do understand that that's something that you empathize with as well. And we are dealing with that as well. So there are tremendous amount of challenges in this industry. And the one challenge that I want to pick out here was the first one, because that seems to be the most relevant. And what we've realized is that while that may have been the case a few years back, but today, meeting your environmental targets does not necessarily need to be at odds with financial goals. We've been investing a lot on energy efficiency solutions. And from our experience across geographies, you can get ROIs between 8 to 15% if you invest in the right kind of solutions. And tomorrow we have a sustainability showcase upstairs, and we can talk more about that in detail. Renewable energy production costs have plummeted over the last decade, except this latest inflationary environment. Till 2020, solar panels have become 90% cheaper in the last decade. And that has enabled a lot of countries to achieve grid parity against brown energy cost. What we have personally seen in many geographies, institutional tenants are now starting to avoid buildings that are not green enough because they have their own net zero targets. Once that starts happening, your leasing timeline is going to get dragged on, your IRRs are going to drop, and you run the risk of stranding of assets. And that, for us, may not be a direct financial impact, but it's clearly an indirect financial impact. Corporates whose portfolios are green are beginning to attract more sustainable financing, and I'll share a bit more details on that. And that is giving you interest rate savings as well. You can also enjoy better credit ratings. So there are multiple reasons why we need to debunk this myth that if I have to go green, it has to be at the expense of making financial sense. What we wanted to do now is take you through a journey of how this industry should adopt a holistic approach in their sustainability focus and journey. And as we go through this, I wanted to strip it down to the basics and showcase how CLI adopts each of these principles and addresses each of these steps. The first thing that any company, real estate or not, needs to do in their sustainability journey is something very, very basic. Accurately, comprehensively collect the right data and get it audited. And it seems very basic for a mature industry, but I can tell you, majority of the globally today are struggling with this. And it was highlighted in the earlier session as well, the importance of getting those data out, and the 27 indicators by SGX is a fantastic example of how important and relevant that is. Now, how does CLI does that? Since 2007, we developed an internal system called an environment tracking system. It is based on a globally recognized cloud platform, and it is a system which captures all our environment data across our asset classes in a bottom-up manner across the globe, and that system helps us to regularly monitor, report, both for external purposes and for our internal tracking on a very, very granular basis. And any business unit CEO can go to the system through access control, pull out their dashboards, and see how their portfolios are performing on the environment parameters. The chart on the right is a snapshot of CLI's carbon footprint. And I wanted to showcase this just to give a context of where do we stand when you keep hearing things about scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1 is all the direct fuel that you burn in your business. That for us is very, very small, 2%. The only component of Scope 1 for us is if you've got diesel generators on our properties as backups, and I have to use them in case power fails, and the diesel that I burn there, that's my Scope 1. For us, it's a very small percentage. Most of our buildings are beautifully electrified globally. The biggest one for us is our Scope 2 emissions, which is the indirect emissions through the purchase of electricity. And if the grid that we are purchasing electricity from is not green enough, then that adds the carbon footprint. Almost 47% of our footprint in 2021, these numbers are from a sustainability report that was published earlier, is Scope 2. Scope 3, which is 51% and the biggest, and the real number may actually be higher because we haven't fully yet mapped out our entire Scope 3, is essentially the emissions coming from our tenants, and that is the big number that you see here, and also the emissions that may come from the embodied carbon of the developments that we do. But because we do very few developments compared to our entire AUM, that number remains very small for us. Now, this number can keep changing year on year, but broadly, once we complete mapping out of our supply chain emissions as well, which we are in the process of doing, then the Scope 3 number may become slightly bigger. And our focus, when we have announced our net zero targets, right now for 2050, is on Scope 1 and Scope 2. And the only reason we didn't put a target to Scope 3 net zero is because we want to make sure, and it comes to greenwashing again, we want to make sure that we have accurately mapped our Scope 3, and then we put a timeline to when we are going to go net zero on Scope 3. The second step, once you've done that, is establishing a very clear ESG strategy. But the more important part of not just establishing the strategy is to make sure you integrate the principles in the entire real estate life cycle. How we did that? We came up with the Sustainability Master Plan in 2020, where we said, okay, 2050 is a bit far out anyways. I'm going to set myself targets for 2030, and I'm going to hold myself accountable by tracking my progress on those targets. And these targets were built bottom up. We worked with a consultant for almost a year, building by building across the 1,000+ buildings we have globally, and saying for each country and each asset class, what should be the targets based on current performance, based on industry benchmarks, based on the net zero trajectory that I want to have, and then put a number for 2025 and for 2030. So for example, we said we want to reduce our carbon emission intensity on a per square meter basis by 78% from a 2008 baseline. Energy efficiency by 35%, water by 45%. We said we want to power 35% of our portfolio from renewable energy sources, and we want to make sure that by 2030, our entire portfolio is green. Similarly, we said on the social aspect, we want to make sure that there is zero fatality from a safety perspective. We put in internal targets on diversity, on equity. We said we want to have 100% compliance to a supply chain code of conduct with our supply chain partners. And we want to make sure that our coverage of green leases goes as close to possible as 100% well before 2030. And what we said was, we're going to set up a pillar of market leadership as an enabler that's going to help us achieve all of that by investing in technology and through sustainable finance. And I'll come to that a bit later. And running through all these pillars is our watertight, robust principles on governance, a lot of which was talked about earlier as well. So that's how we mapped out our plan, ambitious, but quantified, where investors and stakeholders can track how we are doing. But setting the plan was one thing. The next thing that we did was to make sure that we integrate all the principles in our life cycle. How do we do that? At the investment stage, which we think is the most important because that's where the rubber hits the road. If you miss it at that time, it's very hard for you to catch up. So what we said is we are going to implement an internal carbon price, which can vary geography by geography at the time of investments. We try our best to underwrite the right CapEx that is needed at the due diligence stage to green the building if at the time of acquisition it's not meeting our green standards. Every investment in CLI goes through a very detailed environmental health and safety impact assessment where we peg not only the current parameters of that building, we evaluate what is the gap of that building from my 2030 targets and what do I need to do to cover that gap. And we also assess what we call as return on sustainability. And I said, okay, if I'm going to put $100 to improve the chiller in this building, what kind of efficiencies can I get in? All of these numbers get integrated into our FS model when we make our investments. At the design and redevelopment stage, we make sure that we follow capital and sustainable building guidelines so that we are designing for the right green features. And when it comes to operations, our asset managers and our property managers are continuously tracking how does this building over the year perform against my targets. And every year when we do our budgeting, we need to make sure that the CAPEX and the OPEX that we are underwriting is also aligned to the progressive journey each of this building has to make. And end of the day, at the bottom, all our targets get included in our balanced scorecard framework, and earlier we talked a lot about that. So in quite some ways, Chikun's bonus and mine, of course, are linked to how my buildings are going to perform on ESG till 2030. Sorry, Chikun, I took that liberty, but that's a fact, right? The third step after we do that, and for me, this is the most important step of any company's decarbonization journey, which is identify your pathways and your specific levers. And this is where you start making that shift from just setting targets to making this real. How do we do that in capital and investments? We follow our own carbon mitigation hierarchy. Now, this sounds quite scientific. It's not rocket science. You can Google and you will see a lot of CMH out there. But the important point of any CMH is that you have to contextualize it to your business and what makes sense for you. So for us, what it means, we start at the top. Whenever we are designing any new building upfront or doing any AI or redevelopment, we have to make sure that our principles are accounting for avoiding any carbon consumption as much as possible. So how can I use more natural daylight? How can I use cool paints? How can I use material with less embodied carbon and things like that, right? Once I've made sure that I've designed it to ensure that I'm avoiding as much carbon as possible, and then when the building starts operating, my focus is on reducing. And there are two elements to it. Energy efficiency is the most critical holy grail of levers that you can use to decarbonize your operating building. How can I use more energy efficient HVAC equipment? How can I use zoned air conditioning, zoned lighting? How do I use high efficiency boilers? How can I use district cooling as much as possible? All these are key levers under energy efficiency. The third step there is essentially where technology comes into foray. And this is where you use IoT and the power of cloud to put all your buildings on a cloud network so that they can talk to each other. You can do automated fault detection and diagnosis. You can do predictive analysis. And that's where you start being smarter and integrating AI into your operations. And all of that then starts helping to reduce and giving you more data, because as they often say, you can't manage what you don't measure. And that's what helps you to have a forecast of how your data is going to perform and how can you improve. Then we go to replace. After I've done all of that, in parallel, how can I replace the source of electricity? And there are two key levers there. We look at on-site renewable. And Jonathan mentioned earlier an example of how you've used rooftop solar successfully. Not only do we look at maximizing rooftop solar, we're also continuously looking at new technologies. It could be on-site waste to energy generation. It could be using BIPVs, which is essentially use solar panels on the facades. And it could be things like micro wind turbines on your rooftop. And we continue to invest. But there's only a limit to how much on-site renewable can give you. Just to give you a ballpark for those of you who may not have much idea about this, you take a 500,000 square feet building with, let's say, 40, 50,000 square feet of floor plate. With the best, most energy efficient solar panels, if you pack your entire rooftop with solar, how much energy of the entire building do you think it can give you? Any guesses? What percentage? If my building is consuming 100, how much can that solar panel rooftop can give you? Just throw out some numbers, random. Yeah, it's often less than 10%, often. Is it meaningful enough? Absolutely, yes. Every drop counts. I would any day take that 8 to 10% than do nothing at all. But is that enough on its own? No. And that is why we look at how can we go to off-site power producers in most of the countries where it's possible and get my PPAs logged in to deliver renewable energy. After we have done all of that, we try to see wherever we have the gaps, and I cannot have, for regulatory reasons, renewable energy PPAs, how can I use RECs, renewable energy certificates, and cover that gap? And after we have done all of that, what we call as the last mile is how we look at carbon offsets. According to SBTi, which is a Science-Based Target Initiative, ideally, for your net zero journey, you shouldn't be using more than 5 to 10% for offsets. So in our approach, only the residual hard-to-abate carbon that you cannot remove even after all of this, we will go and look at offsets. And even when we go and look at offsets, we will look at nature-based offsets, and the integrity and the governance of those offsets will be extremely critical for us. Some examples of how we put this in life. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. This is an example of our intelligent building platform. That's the IoT solution that we use to continue to monitor all our buildings. You will see more of that in the showcase upstairs. And if you see on the last bullet on the right, we are concurrently piloting more software as a solution initiatives from the market to compare against the solution that we have and continue to see how do we better ourselves. On renewables, every country is making strides. The example of India was shown already, where at a country level, almost 35 to 40% of our entire power needs are sourced from renewable energy, and we're continuing to improve that as well. We've made strides in Europe. We already talked about Singapore, and we will continue to deepen this as we go along. Sustainable finance is a critical tool in our decarbonization journey. We have, as of today, as CLI on its own and all the REITs put together, raised over $10 billion of sustainable finance of all types. We were, in fact, at that time in 2018, the first and the largest SLL in Asia's real estate sector. And if you look at the breakdown of our sustainable finance, it's essentially made up of two major kinds. The blue one that you see is a sustainability-linked loan, and the green one that you see is the green loan. What is the difference? The sustainability-linked loan is pegged to clear targets. You can invest it anywhere. The green loan has defined use cases of proceeds. We do this with multiple banks, and we are very thankful for all our banking partners, and the pool of banks keeps increasing. And how do we peg our sustainability-linked loans? This was just to give you a flavor of how does this work. Mainly three kinds of targets. First is a performance rating on global ESG benchmarks. These are things like GRESB and DJSI. If we continue to perform well, our interest rates can drop and we can get savings there. Second, a minimum green building percentage of the entire portfolio. So if I make sure that X% of my portfolio remains green, I get interest rate savings. And third, which is getting even more specific, because we have 2030 targets, there are loans that we have that are actually pegged to those targets. If I can deliver on the energy, water, waste targets, my interest rate goes down. So these are the ways we structure most of our SLLs. How does it help us? That's obvious. Interest rate savings, it deepens our financing partners, and it makes sure we continue to be the leader in this space in the market. The fourth step, and this is very critical as well, is to strengthen your innovation engine to source technology. There's a common saying in this industry that 50% of the technology in the market today that you need to go to net zero are not even known to you. And I'm not surprised, because we're talking about a 30-year journey. So our job is to make sure that the 50% that is known, we are at the forefront of sourcing that globally. And how do we do that? In 2020, we started running a challenge called Capital and Sustainability X Challenge. It's the largest of its kind in the sector here, in this region. And it's essentially our way to crowdsource technologies from all over the world in our challenge statements around our sustainability targets. But the beauty about the challenge is not just about the prize money that we give. Actually, the prize money is not the big pull. But what we do is we fund the pilots of all these solutions, and we give these solutions a platform across our global portfolio to come and test bed. And we fund that. And once these are successful, we scale them up in our entire portfolio. And because CLI is so diverse in the number of countries we operate and the asset classes we are in, this is a huge pull factor for a lot of companies. I'm not going to go into, these are the examples from our first challenge that concluded in 2021. But this is now starting to become real. This company here, and you will see more of this company upstairs tomorrow in the showcase, we completed and certified this pilot. We ran this in Singapore. This is about putting a net in your AHUs. Sounds very mundane and boring, but this has given us up to 51% savings in energy usage and up to 16% in the cooling load. When we calculated the ROIs in Singapore's context, this is an ROI of not more than 3 years for us. So just imagine if we replicate these energy savings, and this can be installed in all asset types. And we are now in the process of scaling this up across all our assets in Singapore. So these are the kind of examples of how we make decarbonization real. This company that you see here is essentially piloting solar, it retrofits insulated glasses on facades of buildings. We did that in Creekside in the US, and just yesterday we got to know that they have actually, their first results have confirmed, and they've gotten more than 10% savings in heat and energy beyond what they have targeted here as 10%. So that's how this is real for us. The pilot that we ran in 2022 gave us these 10 solutions, which we're going to start implementing across. And all of these solutions from this year's challenge, we are going to pilot this 14 times in 6 countries in 6 asset classes. This is a treasure trove of how we continue to source technology to solve our environmental challenges. Not only externally, we have a system where we source innovation internally from within CLI. Let's not forget, we have got thousands of people who are tech experts in our operating teams globally. We have set up a $50 million innovation fund to be spent over the next 5 years. A big part of that is dedicated to sustainability. And examples like these showcase how people in our operating teams anywhere in the world can flag up solutions. It goes through a process, but if they get selected, they get to pilot, they get the funding, and they pilot these technologies internally. Once we've done all of that, establishing a rigorous monitoring and reporting mechanism is extremely important, because that's how we get trust and transparency. CapitaLand is aligned to most key international frameworks which are related to sustainability, and we have been consistently featured in renowned global indices. A lot of these names will be familiar to you. GRI is the reporting standard. These are the UN SDGs to which we subscribe to. That's the pin that you see here. TCFD was mentioned here earlier, and I want to highlight that because we are in the process of completing our climate scenario analysis as per TCFD and coming out with what does that mean in terms of my entire portfolio's value at risk. And all of that has been accredited with the fact that we have been listed in Dow Jones Index for the last 10 years. We've been MSCI 5-star rated, AAA rated. We've been GRESB global sector lead in the diversified listed category. We've been on FTSE, on S&P Global, and all the major indices. Now, whatever we do to decarbonize our portfolio, and these are the outcomes of the recognitions we have. Do we chase them for the sake of chasing them? No. But these are outcomes to reward the good work that our teams do on the ground day in and day out. And reporting our progress is equally important, because if we don't continue to track ourselves against our targets, then it's very tough to convince that we really mean business. And this is an example of the reporting scorecard that we use on a regular basis to all our stakeholders, including yourself. We say, where do we stand in our energy and water reduction? These are our numbers as the first half of 2022. We reduced an energy and water intensity by 51%. We said we've reduced carbon intensity by 55. Almost half of our global portfolio is already green today. On the social side, we have 85 nationalities being represented in CLI globally. Actually, when I first saw this number, I was surprised. But we actually have 85 nationalities in our company globally. More than 40% of our senior management are women, and almost 100% of our suppliers have signed up our supply chain code of conduct. These are half-year ratings, so nearly 100% of our people attend mandatory trainings on fraud, bribery, and corruption, diversity and equity, etc. And those were the examples of how we use finance and technology, which I just talked about earlier. So reporting is a critical part to gain trust. Once we do that, it is extremely important to set the right ESG governance structure. And that, again, is a key part, along with reporting, to build trust. How do we do that in CLI? We've got sustainability, and in the morning, you heard from Anthony, we've got sustainability embedded right in the strategy committee of the board of directors. Under that, we've got the CLI Leadership Council and the CLI Management Committee, which oversees the execution and strategic implementation of most of our sustainability efforts. But if you ask me honestly, from my experience over the last 6 months of doing this in the company, the team where most of the value and the real knowledge on the ground sits is this, which is every month we've got a global sustainability implementation committee, which is made up of sustainability professionals from each of our business units all around the world, all our REITs, all our operating teams, all our corporate teams. We come together every month. We update each other on where we are on a performance target. We cross-share a lot of successful case study, and that is where the real penetration of sustainability knowledge happens in the company. So as you can see, right from the top to the bottom, this is how we try to integrate sustainability governance and not just stop at the board level. And lastly, while we can do all of that, if we are not proactive in our stakeholder engagement and communication, it will not be possible for us to keep communicating and engaging our communities. So for us, our customers, our investors, all of you here, our own people, our communities are the key stakeholders. And we have multiple initiatives across the year where we keep engaging these stakeholders, but not just keep engaging them, we gather feedback on how we are doing and how can we better our performance. And one example that I do want to highlight is the social impact that we have been making through the Capital and Hope Foundation. Jonathan did touch upon it earlier, and I just wanted to elaborate that a bit more. Since its inception, there are many figures on this slide, but I'll only highlight 3. Since its inception, we have partnered with our institution in coming out with more than $50 million of support for various causes across education, across healthcare, across senior living assistance, et cetera, the key mandates for CHF. We've built 31 Hope Schools. We call them Hope Schools, where we build schools ground up for the underprivileged community, especially in our emerging markets in China, Vietnam, and in India. And I've personally overseen construction of 2 such schools in India, and I can tell you the impact that these schools make. And sometimes sitting here in Singapore, we don't appreciate that because we take primary education for granted. But in emerging markets, where going to a school is a privilege, you see the power of these schools. An anecdote that stayed with me forever was when I was visiting the school, and one of the girls told me that the reason that more girls in their community are now attending school is because now they have a school that has a girls' toilet. Can you believe that? That's the reason the girls in that community have been out of school. So for me, when as CLI, we invest our effort, our money, our energy, and our people's time in these, this is extremely fulfilling on the real impact that you're creating on the ground. And by doing that, we have touched almost 500,000 lives and beneficiaries that we have supported since the inception of CHF. And in the next 5 years, we've got plans to multiply the impact of what CHF can deliver and the kind of initiatives that can partner with in different parts of the world. So what have we learned as a leader in sustainability in this sector? I was thinking hard about this, and there's so much, and I was finding it tough to break it down. But I think we've been taught in the rule of 3, so I tried to restrict myself to 3. And I think the first one was, there really is no silver bullet. I wish there was, but there isn't. We need to keep experimenting with different solutions, different approaches in parallel. Some will fail, and we have to accept that. And we also have to be mindful about the bias to go towards groundbreaking ideas that can create headlines, and that sound fantastic in newspaper, but they come only once in a blue moon. Vis-a-vis the power of low-risk solutions that may not be that high profile, but they do the job for me. The second, and I think that's probably the most key for me, is consistent progress. 2050 is a long time away. I don't know how many of us will be doing what we are doing 30 years down the line. So what is important for us in the next 3, 5, 7 years? How can I make consistent progress, take those little steps that will all add up, and show that consistency in a way that is tangible and can be measured as my journey towards my science-based targets. And while I'm doing that, it's important for me to demonstrate flexibility and adaptability, because whether we like it or not, things will change. Regulations will change, we know that. New standards will come in. New certifications may be required. So how can I be flexible and not get tied up with what I'm doing and be ready to be nimble and keep moving? That, I think, is what builds resilience in a journey towards sustainability. And the last is the power of partnerships. This is not a fight that CLI can win alone. And for me, this is a topic which is so beautiful because this is where competitors can become partners. This is where you can tie up with government agencies, with your suppliers, with your customers, with your people. And it's only the collective strength of those partnerships that will get us over the line. And that's how you develop trust and governance. So for us, these probably are the 3 key learnings that we've gained over the last many years of being on this journey. And I say many years because, as it was mentioned earlier by Anthony, we published our first sustainability report in 2010, which referenced the GRI, which is a gold standard for global reporting. That's how back we started this journey. And as we moved along, there were multiple milestones. I won't go through all of them, but I think a critical one was when we pledged support to TCFD in 2017, 5 years back, is when we pledged support to TCFD. And every year, we have kept deepening our reporting on TCFD. And then in 2020, we launched our master plan, which was the next big milestone. And since then, the CSXC, the net zero pledge, and everything that I just showed you that we've been doing. So we've come a long way in this journey over the next 10 years. Where do we go from here now? And the key focus for CLI in its ESG journey is moving from the what to the how. We have set up plans. We know where we want to go. The question is, what do I do day in, day out in order to reach my targets? 4 things that I want to leave you with in terms of our journey over the next few years. First, we are absolutely focused on our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. How are we going to do that? We have defined decarbonization pathways, and I shared all of that earlier with you. The point now is to execute our pathways across our investment portfolio. We are continuing to look to see what is the kind of capex that I need to invest to get as close to my targets as I can. What are the ROIs that I'm getting? What is my renewable energy strategy in each of the countries? And end of the day, how do I look at offsets? And that is the biggest area where our focus will be over the next few years. As we do that, in parallel, we are going to strengthen our coverage of our Scope 3 emissions. There are still items, especially across the supply chains, which we have not quantified. But we've already quantified a big chunk of our Scope 3, which most companies in the sector still haven't. So we're already ahead of the game. But we want to make sure we cover all our material categories of Scope 3, especially our downstream leased assets. And we continue to work with our customers and our tenants to make sure that our green leases implementation across the portfolio is as close to 100% as possible, because the green lease is my tool to make sure my customers are on the same journey that I'm on. Because if that doesn't happen, I can do everything that I just showed, and I'm only going to decarbonize half of my portfolio, because the other half is my tenant's consumption. So this, for us, working through green leases, is an extremely critical component. The third thing that we want to continue to do is deepen the impact of Capital and Hope Foundation in the social impact that we make with our community. And as part of doing that, we will also be disclosing new social targets under our SMP 2030. When we launched the master plan, we said every 2 years we are going to review our targets. And this is that year of review. And early next year, we will release some of our new targets, which will further strengthen our commitment to our impact. And lastly, like probably with every other part of the business, it all boils down to your culture and your capabilities. So a huge focus of internally working, how do we ingrain sustainability as a culture in every individual of the company? And how do I make sure that I'm getting the right ESG skill sets and capabilities and developing them in the company to be able to achieve my targets? So those are the key priorities as we move forward. That was the last slide of my presentation, but there are 2 more things I'm going to do in the next 2 minutes that I have on the clock. One is, again, a request to pull out your phones, please, if you can. And I want to hear from you on this question, because I want to leave the audience with a pulse or where the mood stands on this question. How do you think organizations should view ESG performance of companies that they are investing in relation to shareholder returns? First, shareholder returns remain the most important, and ESG performance is only a good to have. Second, both have equal importance while making investment decisions. Third, ESG performance is becoming a filter at the investment level before you even assess shareholder returns. And finally, there's no fixed preference. It depends on a case-by-case basis. I'll give you all another 15 seconds to think about this. It could be your personal preference, your organization's view. Please feel free. I am seeing the results, and I think it's heartening and intuitive, and I'll just show it to you in a second. But the bars are still moving, so any more inputs? Can we show the answers, please? nearly half of you have said that ESG performance is becoming a filter even before you assess potential shareholder returns. And I'm considering that's reflective of the mood on the ground, because I'm sure the people present in this room with how big CLI is represent the overall sentiment of investors in this country. And then there's a quarter of you which are saying that both have equal importance. And I think this is heartening for us to know, because this reaffirms the approach and the journey that we're taking towards our ESG targets. Before I end, when I was rehearsing this speech with my wife yesterday night, and I finished it, and she said, "Where's the quote?" And I said, "What quote?" She said, "Every presentation needs to end with a bang, with a quote, especially on sustainability. You can't not have a quote." So I said, "Okay, I'll look at a quote." But the good thing was, I didn't actually have to go and Google, because I did hear something from Robert Swan a couple of years ago, which has stuck with me forever. Anybody knows Robert Swan? Okay, one or two hands that I see. Robert Swan is the first person to walk to the North and the South Pole in the world, and he's today one of the leading environmentalists globally. And he said that the biggest threat to our planet is the belief that somebody else will save it. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.